you for about 20 minutes and then entertain questions. But remember, questions may only be asked by members of the working press and press club members. So, without further ado, let's get into the introduction of our speaker. I'm sure yesterday most of you saw that we witnessed the oldest professional golfer in history to ever win a major tournament. Well, today we have the honor of listening to one of the youngest members ever elected to the Louisiana House of Representatives. He was also our Secretary of Commerce for a while. Our speaker is a nationally respected writer, pollster, political analyst who has a very unique background in government politics and in media. He graduated from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of New Orleans and a law degree from LSU. And he's taught courses in politics at both Georgetown and George Washington University for over 20 years. He publishes a very popular daily newsletter called Lunchtime Politics and contributes columns for newspapers around the country, including the Wall Street Journal, Times-Picayune, Advocate. And he's also been the editor of Campaigns and Elections, which is a nationally renowned political newsletter, magazine. And he's actually authored or edited 6 books on politics, including a book called Running for Office, and he's actually writing a book now on Franklin Roosevelt. He's been interviewed by hundreds of newspapers, magazines, and radio stations around the globe. And he's even appeared numerous times on some show y'all may have heard, hosted by some guy named Jim Inkster. So y'all may have heard him on that show. He's appeared over 300 times on national network shows. He's as a nonpartisan analyst, which makes him perfectly qualified to speak on this topic today, which is what happened to the political middle. So let's give a warm Baton Rouge Press Club welcome to Dr. Ron Faucheux.
Thank you very much. It's good to be in a room where I think I recognize just about every face in here. We have worked together and for a variety of things for a long time. So thank you for coming up and thank you for inviting me. What I'd like to do is I'd like to start by just kind of giving you a little bit of a recap on some of the polls that we've seen in recent days in the national situation that you may find interesting. And then I'd like to get into the topic of the discussion in terms of the political center and do we still have one and what's happened to it. In looking at the polls, one thing we see is that President Biden is holding up a job approval rating of about 54-55% right now, which isn't bad. His negative ratings are in the low 40s, and given the polarity of the political process, that compared to other presidents at this point, he's sort of in the middle of the range there, and. But the problem he has, and I think a lot of people have asked me, well, why is he doing so well? Why is he over 50? Why is he in the majority? And I think the answer is that he's holding the 53% of the electorate that voted against Trump. Now, he didn't get all 53 of it, but 53% did not vote for Trump. And I think essentially Biden is holding those voters. And he's also getting an extra point or two, I think basically goodwill, still in the early stage of his term. But when you get into the issues, there are signs of trouble for him. First of all, he's got a 55% approval rating on handling the pandemic. And I think that has helped him a lot. It's reinforced that 53 to 55%. I think people feel like he was given a difficult problem to deal with and that he's handled it pretty well. 48% approve his handling of the economy and jobs, which is not quite as good as what Donald Trump was polling, but it's still more positive than negative. Although, when a president's elected with 51%, you always want to look at job ratings to see how it compares to the percentage he was elected with. So if he's elected with 51%, if he has an overall 55% approval rating, his approval rating is better than his political standing was, which is good for somebody. But when he's got 48% on something as important as the economy, that means he's underperforming his overall political strength, and that is a potential sign of danger. One thing that just popped up the other day, which I thought was interesting, because crime, for the most part, unless and until Donald Trump talked about law and order, was not much of a national issue for a long time because crime was going down. But now crime we see it really bubbling up around the country, and I've seen some polls in New Orleans that certainly show that too, and that it's becoming an increasingly viable issue. And Biden's rating on handling crime is only 41% approve. So that's a potential problem. And I think you're going to see Republicans talking about the crime issue in 2024. And then on handling of Israel, he's at 30%, which was particularly low since that's been the major foreign policy crisis of his term so far. So there's a lot of red flags there, and in terms of where he is and where he may be going. When voters were asked if you could vote for Congress, would you vote for a Democrat or Republican? But one poll in particular, and I thought this was kind of interesting. It said, would you vote Democratic for Congress? Would you vote for a Republican who supports Trump or a Republican who does not support Trump? 38% said they'd vote Democratic. 33% said they'd support a Republican who supports Trump. And 7% said they would support a Republican who does not support Trump. And I think the point of this is very interesting. And I've talked to quite a few Republican officials of one sort or another in recent weeks. And one thing I keep telling them is whether you like Donald Trump or not, and whether you want to use him in a primary or not, the Republican Party needs to disconnect from him as soon as they can. Because Donald Trump is basically seen by the 74 million voters who voted for him as the bulwark against the wacko left. And as long as he is the bulwark and the only bulwark against the left, he gets votes. But Republicans need to replace him with new people, with new names, who don't have that baggage. Because the 7% difference in a national poll, as this one shows, is the difference between winning control of the House and Senate and not. So Republicans need to be very careful in how they deal with their support of Donald Trump. On the Mideast, more voters support Israel than the Palestinians. But interestingly, when you ask where your sympathies lie, only 33% say Israel. 15% say Palestinians, and 26% say about equal. One of the things that we're seeing in polls is that Democrats are moving away from support of Israel. And that has happened most recently and is an interesting complication on this issue now. Now, getting into the whole issue of a political center. Is it disappearing? Do we still have it? Those of us in Louisiana, we remember electing a lot of people to Congress, to the House and the Senate. One of them is gracing us today with his presence, who were independent-minded people who looked at the world from the political center, who wasn't part of an extreme on either side. And that includes many Democrats, because Louisiana was a one-party Democratic state for a while. and around the country it included Republicans as well. We don't really see many people like that anymore. In fact, the Democrats in the Senate have really got down to there's probably only one genuine centrist left, and that's Joe Manchin, and possibly Kristen Sinema from Arizona, but we really haven't seen her voting record show that clearly. But and of course, Joe Manchin, given the current situation, is the most important vote in the Senate right now. Because he's in a position to stop and modify and moderate a lot of Democratic policies. So, and Susan Collins is sort of viewed as a similar force on the Republican side. And Republicans are always concerned they will lose her to the Democrats. And when you've got a 50-50 Senate, that becomes really important. But one of the things I think that we look at in terms of the political center is there a political center left in Congress? No, not really, not much. And I think we see that more and more in state legislatures, not only in Louisiana, but in other states too. The center's shrinking, and the hard partisan votes on each side are replacing it. But even though we don't see a political center in Congress anymore, we do have a political center in the electorate. And for instance, an Economist poll recently showed that 28% of voters consider themselves independents nationally. That's equivalent to 45 million voters across the country. That's a lot of people who aren't affiliated with either party. And in Louisiana, the latest voter rolls show that 27% are in the independent column, which includes third parties as well as non-affiliated. So it's pretty close to what the Economist poll showed for the country as a whole. Now, talk about independence a little bit. First of all, but before we go on, I think we need to get our definition straight. And the words independent, centrist, moderate are often used interchangeably, but there are technical differences between them. They're not mutually exclusive, but they aren't the same thing either. An independent is somebody who is not aligned with any political party. I'm an independent, for example. A centrist is somebody who is somewhere between the left and the right ideologically. So independent is a partisan position. Centrism is an ideological positioning. And then finally, moderate. And moderate is really temperament and tone. There are a lot of conservatives that we've seen here in Louisiana and we've seen around the country, and liberals, who are moderate in tone and temperament. But their voting records aren't moderate. They're pretty strong conservatives or they're pretty strong liberals. I think that applied to a large degree to Joe Biden, to some other people who ran for president on the Democratic side, like Amy Klobuchar. I never considered Amy Klobuchar to be a moderate. She was always a pretty solid liberal Democrat in the Senate. But because of where she was positioned in her tone and temperament, she seemed to be moderate. John Bell Edwards, for example, he's a good example. He's not an independent because he's a Democrat, so he's affiliated. You could argue that he's a centrist because he's not all the way to the left or all the way to the right. And you could also argue that he's a moderate in terms of his tone and his temperament. So you know, in looking at people in public office, I think it's good to have that sense of where it is. Now, a lot of people say independents can't win because they don't have any money and they don't have any organized support. And they're right. Generally speaking, that's right. But that doesn't mean that voters aren't hungering for something in the middle of the political spectrum. Ross Perot, I think, was the best example. Between February of 1992 and May of 1992, Ross Perot went from being basically an unknown Dallas businessman to running first in the polls for President of the United States. And he hadn't spent one penny on a campaign yet. And so his message, nonpartisan, anti-partisan message, was working. He got out the race, gets back in the race, 5 weeks, I think it was, before the election, and still gets 19% of the vote, which was the biggest vote a third-party candidate had since Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. So then people say, well, he lost. He didn't get what he wanted. He wasn't elected president. And that's right. But what they forget was that the Ross Perot voter became the swing voter in American politics. And in the 1994 midterm elections, those swing voters swung to the Republicans, and they shocked the system. The Republicans in 1994 won control of both houses of Congress for the first time in a long time, just wiped Democrats out in governorships and state houses. And the point was that even though the independent didn't get elected president, his supporters made the difference as a swing vote, and made a big, big difference because they pretty much coalesced on one side. And so it shows you what can happen when that vote comes together. Now, looking at a few things here, one of the things in terms of independents and political parties, Gallup had a poll out earlier this year that found, and listen to this, this is really, I thought it was unbelievable when I heard it, and I had to go look at the data and check it for myself. But 62% of the nation's voters think the two major parties do such a poor job that a third party is needed. 62%. What a stinging rebuke that is. Now, the parties, and one thing that's going on in politics today is that there's a lot of colleagues of mine who are political consultants and political analysts, and they advise both parties now, and they go around saying, forget about the people in the middle of the centrist, the independents. They don't matter. It's the base of the party that matters. They give the money. They do all the work. Elections are now about base turnout. The Republicans started that pretty much in the year 2004 in the Bush-Kerry race. It was about, it was more about turnout than it was persuading the voters in the middle. And now it keeps getting more and more like that, to the point that now you have, certainly on both the Democratic and Republican side, significant politicians specifically saying, we don't want to appeal to the middle. We want to get our people out to vote, and that's all we're interested in. And I think that they have to be very careful in doing that, in saying that voters in the middle don't matter. Voters in the middle elected both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. In 2020, both Biden and Trump received virtually unanimous support among their party members. They each got 94% of Democrats and Republicans. But Biden won independents, which represented more than a quarter of the electorate, by a 13-point margin, 54-31. 4 years earlier, Trump won independents over Hillary Clinton by 4 points, 46-42. And to show the effect on the electoral votes, Biden won Georgia by 0.2 of a point last year, but he won independents in Georgia by 9 points. Without winning independents by a significant margin, he would not have come close to winning in Georgia. 4 years ago, Trump won independents over Hillary. 4 years ago, Trump won independents over Hillary Clinton in Michigan by 16 points. And Trump only carried the state of Michigan by 0.2 of a point. So you can see the influence there. Now, regardless, and we can talk about party labels and this and that, and I think we all know that party labels are built on shifting sand, that times change, they mean different things. Liberal conservative means different things, populist, establishment candidates, nationalists, whatever it is, mean different things at different times. But regardless of the labels we use, I think there are a significant amount of voters in this country who are not rigid ideologues and who are not partisan automatons. They're cross-pressured. When I say cross-pressured, there were a lot of voters who voted in 2020 who didn't like Donald Trump's conduct, his personal behavior, but they liked his policies. There were a lot of voters who voted who liked Joe Biden, thought he was a good guy, but didn't like the Democratic Party's move to the left. So a lot of voters, they just have a lot of different pressures on them. And political consultants and experts tend to think that's inconsistency. But it's not inconsistency. It's how a lot of people think. And that matters. To give you a specific example, in 2016, the exit polls showed, which means that at the end of the race, 18% of voters disliked both Trump and Hillary Clinton. 18%. They were cross-pressured. And those voters broke at the last minute for Trump. And that's how he won the election, plain and simple. And Hillary Clinton's campaign kept saying, well, we have to get the base. We have to get the base. We have to get the base. We've got the base. We've got the base. We've got the base. We don't have to run and worry about Democrats in Michigan or, independents and some moderate, more conservative Democrats in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. We've got the base, and they didn't have it, and that's what can happen. As Charlie Melancon can tell you, the polarization of parties in the U.S. Congress today has reached a point where it really has gotten very difficult to get things done. If you don't have a center, you have nobody to make a deal with. So that means what happens is there's only two ways to get anything done in Congress. One party has to have dominance, like Franklin Roosevelt had in the 1930s or the Republicans had in the 1870s, where they can basically do what they want. Or you have to have a center that's big enough that you can make bargains with to get things done along with a center-right or a center-left coalition. We don't really have that anymore. We basically have Joe Manchin standing up saying, stop, wait, let me look at this. And that's where we are at this point. And people say, well, why is that the case? Well, I think there's two reasons for it. Number one is technology, and number two is money. Technology is a factor because it makes politics and political message conveyance very fast. As we all know, the 24/7 news continuum, and we really don't have a news cycle anymore, it's a continuum now, moves very fast. Technology is also a big factor in political money. I don't know if any of you looked at some of the dollar amounts that were spent in the last Senate elections, but they were just absolutely unbelievable. You had candidates in South Carolina, which is not a big state, and they each spent over $100 million, or had $100 million spent on their behalf. When Clinton and Dole ran against one another, they each spent $45 million for president. And now you have candidates in South Carolina spending hundreds of millions of dollars. I think when it was all added up in Georgia, now you had 2 Senate races there, and they went into runoffs. But I think something like $500 million was spent in Georgia. So the amount of money that's being spent in politics now is just extraordinary. I mean, it's extraordinary. And as somebody who has generally not favored campaign finance regulations, because I think they usually boomerang and have the opposite effect they're intended to, I think it's really a time to sort of rethink everything we've thought about campaign money and to figure out what can be done about this. But the point is that the political parties and the interest groups that ally with the political parties control most of that money. And let me tell you something. You don't raise money in politics, particularly online, by talking about common ground. You raise money in politics online by painting your opponent as evil, as satanic, as the worst things possible. And in that sense of Republicans hating Democrats and Democrats hating Republicans and in painting one another as evil, well, after a certain point, it's two groups. There's nobody in the middle to make deals. And so you don't get anything done unless you destroy the other side, unless you decimate them, you dismantle them. And so when you don't have that happening and you don't have a big center, then clearly nothing gets done. And I think that's where we are right now. And even though Democrats control the House and the Senate and the White House, it makes it very difficult for the at this stage of the game, because of the filibuster rule, for anybody to get anything much out of the Senate. And I think you're going to see the filibuster, the cloture rule, continue to be eroded to the point that in a few years it really probably won't mean a whole lot anymore. But we'll have to see. But I do think that American politics is in a vise grip. It's very hard. I can tell you from my experience in Capitol Hill that it's very hard to sit down and talk about what's the right thing to do. Everything has to be about how do we destroy the other side. And I can give you chapter and verse and specific examples of that. And it's being, and that kind of politics is played by both sides. I know Republicans think, everything's the Democrats' fault, and Democrats think everything's the Republicans' fault, or Trump's fault. But a lot of these things have been going on and have been coming for a while. I would end by saying, you may remember there was a politician in Texas named Jim Hightower, who is a populist of some note, and he said there's nothing in the middle of the road but yellow stripes and dead armadillos. And I actually think that he missed the point there. When you've got tens of millions of voters standing in the middle of the political spectrum, and there are fewer leaders of Congress who represent them, I think that's a big problem. And I think that's a bigger problem than dead armadillos. So if we have any comments, thoughts, even questions if they're not difficult. Yes?
Ron, the last two national elections have been plagued by bad polling. What are pollsters do? What can they do?
Well, let me tell you, I'm in the polling business. Most of the polling I do is not political polling. So the people I'm talking about are not necessarily, in some cases they may be competitors, but I have no need to protect them, But just to give you a little rundown on it, the public polls in the last presidential election got Biden's vote exactly right, the national public polls. They averaged Biden getting 51.5%, and he got 51.3%. So they were off only 0.2 of a point. Now, when I say the polls, it means the averages that I do in my newsletter, which I think are the best way now to look at polls. So the polls are getting the Democratic numbers right. But on Trump, they miss Trump. They show Trump getting about 43.5%, and he got almost 47%. So they were about 3.5 points under what Trump got. We saw something similar in the 2016 election, although the numbers weren't quite as bad. And I've looked at the state-by-state polls, both in the Senate races and in president. And I have to tell you that there is an inescapable conclusion. And the inescapable conclusion is that public polls are biased against Republicans, period, over and done with. They are biased against Republicans. And there's just been too much evidence recently that demonstrates that and points to that. Now you say, well, why are they biased against Republicans? Well, there's a lot of reasons to explain why polls may be wrong. First of all, there's a normal margin of error. You know, polls are more of they're a blunter object than people want them to be. And so there's always going to be a few percent there that you just can't get in a close election. You know, polls are also not predictive. They don't predict where things will be in 3 weeks from now. They just tell you where they are now because they're a snapshot in time. So when things change, they change, and a poll can't read that. But I do think that some pollsters have screwed up. I think part of it is sloppy administration of polling, because we've moved a lot from telephone polls to online polls and automated polls. And I'm not saying you can't do a good poll using those new techniques. You can. But you have to be much more careful than ever, and you have to spend the money to have the quality controls. And I'm not sure a lot of polling firms are doing that. The other thing I would point out is Donald Trump tends to close strong. He just does. I mean, he closed strong in 2016. He closed strong in 2020. And a lot of it is because these cross-pressured voters that we talked about, who are sort of in the center of the spectrum in these elections, they're pulled from a lot of different angles on Trump. And some of them like him because of his policies, but they don't like him because of his approach. And that affects a good number of voters. And we pointed out that, you know, in the 2016 election, there was a big, almost 1 out of 5 voters didn't like either candidate. And that was like on election day. That wasn't 6 months before election day. That was election day. And those people broke for Trump because they wanted change. They wanted something different. So Trump is a factor. There are certain parishes in Louisiana and counties around the country where the local political dominant organization has schooled over the years their supporters not to answer poll questions, and specifically not to answer them honestly, because they didn't want the opposition to know where things were. And I think there may be some of that nationally as it affects Trump, that a lot of his supporters who have strong feelings against the national media and against national institutions enjoy, you know, wreaking havoc on the polls. I also think that there is a hidden Trump vote. It's probably a couple of percent, maybe in some places 1%, some places 3%, where people for social reasons don't say they're for Trump. Particularly among white voters with college degrees. White voters with college degrees overall are not big Trump supporters. So if your friends and relatives and neighbors are white with college degrees like you have, and they don't like Trump, a lot of people may not be willing to share that they like Trump. So I think that was a factor, too. I also think that I do think there is bias, as I said before, against Republicans. And I think that bias, you know, is for the most part not conscious. Now, I know my Republican friends will say, of course they know what they're doing. And I disagree with that. I don't think most bias in public polls unless somebody's being really sinister and trying to manipulate an election with a poll. And here and there, maybe that happens. But for the most part, polling firms and media organizations, when they do a poll, they want it to be accurate. They want it to be right. You know, they don't want to look like fools. And so the objective is not to have it look bad. You know, so they want to get the numbers right. But I do think, in all honesty, and I'm talking about a lot of friends here when I say this, and they don't like it when I say it, but a lot of the national polls for the major national media organizations, even though they may be conducted by nonpartisan polling firms, and the objective may be nonpartisan, most of the people working for these companies are Democrats. And the point I'm making here is that they're not lying and cheating to make the Democrats look better. They just have a worldview that's different from the average voter, just like the average conservative has a worldview different than the average voter. And so and one of the things about polling now is that you have to make a lot of assumptions about turnout and composition of the electorate on election day. And you can make honest, pure, ethical assumptions that can be biased in favor of one side or the other. And I think that's what we're seeing. So you add all these things up, and I think that's what it comes to. Now, look, polls still work. The polls in the last elections in Georgia that happened right after the presidential election came within a point of getting everything right. I see polling and participate in polling that's on the nose, and I've seen good pollsters do bad polls. I've seen bad pollsters do good polls, so it's a complex topic, but I think there's something to be said about the whole angle of bias, and I think that needs to be flushed out of the polling. And if you noticed, a lot of media organizations that were showing Biden ahead by 10 or 12 points when he was actually winning by 4 points, they haven't been doing any national polls since then. And I know a number of them are sort of rethinking what they're doing and how they do it. So you got me on a topic that I could go on and on about, but I'm not trying to defend the pollsters because some of them don't do a good job and they're not worthy of being defended. But some of them do. And most of them are honestly trying to get the right numbers, even though I think some of them are making biased assumptions that throw the numbers off. Yeah, Marcia.
I'm trying to understand the Republicans. I understand I'm a Democrat who worked for two really great Republicans, Foster and Gardner. And I like to understand people instead of judging them. I know that's rare in politics, but I'm a Christian. That's how I'm wired. So my question is, I got a lot of Republican friends. This dear lady right here is like an aunt or maybe a grandmother to me.
Oh.
So you're very close. But anyway.
A little sister, maybe, huh? Yeah. Right.
Let me get to my daggone point. The point is, do you have any polling that explains the people that still support Trump given January 6th? Because I don't get it.
Yeah, well, yeah, and the people who still support Trump since January 6th are not that different than the people who supported him on November 3rd or whatever the election was. When you look at polls, what you find is that, like I said, 94% of Republicans voted for Trump, as 94% of Democrats voted for Biden. The last poll I saw showed that 77% of Republican voters had favorable feelings about Trump, and 80% of Democrats had favorable feelings about Biden. So what's interesting is that Biden actually does better among his party than Trump does among his party, even though everybody thinks Trump's party is dominated by him, and Biden's party is not dominated by him. And that's true to a large extent. But I think, we talked about cross-pressured voters, and you seem to be a pretty good example of that, and that you've got pulls on you. That doesn't mean you're looking at the world in an inconsistent way. You look at the personalities of the candidates, the qualifications, their skills. You're looking at, overall ideology, but you're also interested in some specific issues, and some may be more on the right and some may be on the left. Well, my point is that a lot of voters are like that. And ultimately, Donald Trump won his election in 2016 because he did pretty good among those voters in the end, because the big issue was change. In the 2020 election, he held, he actually got more votes than he got the first time, but his percentage was lower. And, his percentage was higher because they didn't have third-party candidates in the race, but the margin was wider. And the point being there is that voters who are supporting Donald Trump see him as the bulwark against the left, plain and simple. Now, some of those centrist voters and voters in the middle that we've been talking about, some of them break for Donald Trump for a whole bunch of reasons, just like some of them break against him. And so when we look at Trump now, some of those voters aren't thrilled about him. They didn't like January 6th. They didn't like the fact that he stayed on this election thing and kept saying, he didn't lose. And so there's about 20% of the Republican Party that's not thrilled about Donald Trump. And depending on how you measure it, it can be as high as 25 or 30%. Okay. But the problem is that Donald Trump has proven he can raise money and he can beat Republican incumbents in Republican primaries. So he's got the Republican elected officials scared to death. And frankly, it doesn't make sense to me why they keep moving towards him at this stage of the game. It would be better for the Republican Party if they weren't running to Mar-a-Lago and trying to get his approval for everything. The best thing for the Republican Party is to learn from Donald Trump's politics, to learn from his policies, some of which were interesting, some of which had impact, pro and con, some of which can fit in a future Republican Party, but at the same time not take his baggage when they do it. And they haven't gotten to that point yet. Yes, sir.
I see it being right now a problem, in Louisiana, by virtue of what has happened in our legislature, even this session,
Right.
and I believe it's a problem perhaps nationwide. But in our next round of text room books for high schools and in college, history books, okay? Do you believe that's going to be a serious problem in writing what happened on January 6th?
Oh, absolutely.
Our next election.
Absolutely. The distrust of public information is growing at an alarming rate. And one of the questions I ask is what happens when most voters don't believe anything? Not just Republicans and Democrats. Most voters don't believe anything. The Republicans don't believe anything Democrats say. Democrats don't believe anything Republicans say. And that's already true. There's reasons why voters don't believe in a lot of the national networks and the newspapers. That's already true. There's a lot of reasons why certain voters don't believe in certain institutions. That's already happened. But at what point, a lot of people don't believe in advertising. They don't believe in corporate America. They don't believe in universities. And I'm not saying they should. I'm just saying the fact is they don't, and it's increasing. So at a certain point, what happens when there is no information that anybody can believe anymore? That everything is spin and goes beyond spin becomes, deliberately deceptive. What happens when people can't believe anything anymore? And I think we're rapidly moving to that.
We have time for one more quick question.
Yeah.
Do you think Trump will run again in 2024?
I don't know. I mean, my guess, if I had to guess today, I'd say no. But who knows? Who knows? I mean, people who have tried to predict Donald Trump haven't fared so well, and so I just soon stay out of that. But my guess is he might not. I'm not sure he enjoyed being president so much, and I'm not sure he wants to go through that again. But who knows? If somebody makes him mad enough, maybe he'll do it.
Marseille mentioned age. One of the things that I noticed about Trump, whether
Right.
you like him or you dislike him,
Right.
support him or don't support him, he didn't age like many presidents, and he really was battered.
Right.
And so, to what do you attribute that? And also, he's still loving it. He loved his job, and we haven't had that enthusiasm. He was creative. He campaigned creatively.
He did,
His
yeah.
boat parades, and he
Right,
really got
right.
people energized and involved, whether they liked him.
Well, no. Well, he certainly encourages people to vote for him and against him. Bill Clinton was like that too. He was a force of nature. They could go with 4 hours of sleep every night, and they didn't age, and they just worked all the time. And but
I want you to comment on Abrams in Georgia, as opposed to the negativism that you see developing.
Right.
Abrams seemed to be capable of bringing out a certain level of enthusiasm in the population at large. One of the things turned out some really first-rate candidates and got them elected. And I'm wondering if anything like that on a national level exists, or the potential for something like that.
Well, I think it does, and I actually think it's a problem, not a benefit for the Democrats. Stacey Abrams is one of those people who say, we don't want to go after centrist voters or voters in the middle. We want to just get our base up and win elections with the base. And there's some Republicans who say the same thing, and I think they're wrong. I think she's wrong, and I think they're wrong. She obviously did a lot of good work, registering voters and getting voters out to vote for Biden and the Democrats in this last election. But I think it was more than the mechanics of what she did and the people around her did. And I think there were some significant changes in the voting patterns of Georgia, particularly with young voters, women in the suburbs, and the like, that together with good turnouts of African American voters made a difference.
Thank you all.
One question.
Okay.
Local.
Okay.
We recently were considering in the legislature a closed primary.
Yeah.
A lot have argued that would help reach or give the centrist, the moderate voter, a greater voice. I'd like to know your thought on the open primary versus closed primary.
Oh boy. The first thing I'll say is, after studying election systems, and I think most political scientists will tell you this, that after you pass them or change them, they always have unintended consequences. Louisiana changed the open primary, went from the party primary to the open primary. I remember standing next to Edwin Edwards during the 1972 election for governor, and I heard him say, when I get elected, I'm going to change the system. I'm not going through 3 elections the next time, because he had to go through the primary, had to beat Bennett Johnson, then he had to beat Dave Freed. And that's why we changed it. There weren't complex, sophisticated reasons for it. He just didn't want to run 3 times anymore. And and that's probably as good a reason as any. But it depends. If you have a closed primary system, then what happens to those 27% who aren't affiliated with either side? Are they allowed to vote in both primaries, or one, or none? That's a big problem. And and nobody's really been looking at that very well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Basically, what I saw